All right, so have you ever just stopped and thought about how, like, all the stuff going on inside your head, your thoughts, your feelings, all that connects to the actual physical world, like your brain and all the stuff around you?
That is, I mean, that's a question, honestly, that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for, well, forever.
Right.
And the sources we have here dive right into it, don't they? Some really deep dives into how people have tried to tackle this whole mind-matter connection, both from the philosophical side and some more modern scientific angles.
Right. It's like this puzzle that keeps coming up, doesn't it? Like we have this inner world that's so rich and so real to us, and then this outer world of stuff that we can bump into and measure, and yet how are they like even talking to each other?
Yeah, that's the classic mind-body problem, isn't it? And that's where we're going to start today. We'll look at that and then move through some of the big ideas that have come up, from the idea of like a totally separate mind to more science-y approaches that look at the brain and behavior, and even this idea of dual aspect monism, which is kind of trying to find a way to bring it all together.
Yeah, like a unified theory of everything, basically, which would be pretty amazing. And we'll even see how this all relates to like our own sense of self, our own identity, which is like, wow, that's getting pretty personal.
And that's really what we're trying to do here. Unpack these ideas that, let's be honest, can get pretty dense and maybe a bit confusing. But we want to make them clear and hopefully even fun to think about.
All right, well, let's start with that mind-body problem. I mean, I think we've all had moments where we're like, hey, my brain's doing what now? It's like we've got all these feelings and ideas swirling around in here, and then we've got this physical body, you know, the brain, which is just a bunch of cells and chemicals and like electrical signals. And how do those two things even connect?
Exactly. That's the heart of it, right? You got the subjective experience, like the feeling of happiness or the taste of coffee or whatever. And it just seems fundamentally different from like objective physical matter, you know, the neurons firing in your brain, all that. How can those two be related?
Yeah, it's like my joy isn't made of atoms, is it? Is it? I mean, some people thought so. Like back in the day, you had philosophers like Descartes who basically said, yep, they're separate. Like the mind is this non-physical thinking thing, and the body is just, well, stuff. Matter. And he even thought they might interact in this tiny spot in the brain, the pineal gland.
But that kind of creates a problem, doesn't it? The so-called interaction problem. Because if the mind isn't physical, how can it possibly influence the physical body? Like how can a thought move a muscle? It's like trying to push a car with your mind, right? It doesn't seem to work that way.
Yeah, like brain lift that donut to my mouth. It doesn't quite happen, does it? But Descartes wasn't the only dualist out there. There was Leibniz, who had this other idea called pre-established harmony. It's like instead of directly interacting, he thought the mind and body were more like two really, really well-synced clocks. They run in perfect parallel without ever actually touching or influencing each other.
It's a pretty elegant idea, I guess, but it does feel a bit coincidental, doesn't it? Like, how did those clocks get so perfectly synced up in the first place?
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder. And that's where you get philosophers like Gilbert Ryle coming in, who was really critical of dualism. He called it the dogma of the ghost in the machine, basically saying that we're making a big mistake by thinking of the mind as some separate thing trapped inside the body.
Like a ghost operating a meat puppet, basically.
Yeah.
And Ryle's point was that when we talk about mental stuff like intelligence or knowing something, we're not actually talking about a secret invisible ghost, right?
Right.
We're talking about how someone acts, how they behave. Like if you say someone is intelligent, you mean they're good at solving problems or learning new things or whatever. You don't mean they have a little intelligence organ hidden somewhere, do you? So for Ryle, the mind isn't a thing. It's a way of describing what a person does, how they function.
Ah, okay. So it's like the ghost is just a metaphor, a way of talking about how the machine, the body works. So no ghost, just a really complex machine. And that's where materialism comes in, right? This idea that everything about the mind can be explained by like physical processes.
Right. And this really took off as science started to figure out more about the world, especially with guys like Isaac Newton and his laws of physics, you know, a universe that runs on predictable laws. And maybe humans are just part of that mechanical system.
Okay, so we're all just little clockwork people following the rules of physics.
Well, there are different flavors of materialism, right? Like you had B.F. Skinner and his radical behaviorism, where he basically threw out the whole idea of the mind as an internal cause. He was all about observable behavior, you know, what you can actually see and measure. And he said that all our actions are just shaped by the environment. through rewards and punishments, what he called contingencies of reinforcement. So no inner self making choices, just a system reacting to its programming, basically.
Wow, so I'm not choosing to eat this donut. It's just the environment influencing my behavior. I mean, that kind of makes sense, but it's also kind of scary, isn't it? Like, where does free will fit into all of this?
Yeah, it's a big question. But then you have folks like J.J.C. Smart, who had a slightly different take. He proposed this thing called the identity thesis, which says that mental states aren't just caused by brain states, they're actually identical to them. So like the feeling of pain is literally the same thing as certain nerve fibers firing in your brain, those C fibers.
So it's like, my pain isn't just caused by my brain, my pain is my brain.
Exactly. And there's some pretty wild examples of this, like, the case of Phineas Gage, the guy who had a metal rod go right through his skull.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. Pretty gruesome.
Well, he survived, but his personality totally changed, which shows how deeply our mental states are tied to what's going on in our brains.
Right. And that brings us back to materialism. And it's not all one big happy family, right? There's eliminative materialism, which sounds even more intense.
Does, doesn't it? Yeah, those folks go even further. They say that our everyday way of talking about the mind, like beliefs and desires and all that, is actually just wrong. Like you're using the wrong categories to understand ourselves,
Yeah.
and that eventually neuroscience will replace all that folk psychology with like a purely physical description. No more beliefs, just neurons firing.
That is wild. So I guess I don't believe in eliminative materialism. I just have a certain configuration of neurons firing. Talk about a head trip.
Yeah.
But there was one more flavor you mentioned, functionalism.
Right, and this one might be the easiest to grasp, at least at first. Think of it like a computer. The brain is the hardware, and the mind is the software running on it. So functionalism defines mental states not by what they're made of, but by what they do, their function in the system.
So it's less about the physical stuff and more about what it does. Like, it doesn't matter if it's neurons or silicon chips as long as it's doing the same job.
Exactly. And that's the idea of multiple realizability. Like the feeling of happiness could be happening in a human brain, an octopus brain, or even a sufficiently advanced AI, as long as they're all doing the same kind of processing, the same functions.
So functionalism is still materialistic, but it's a bit more nuanced, right? It's not just about the physical stuff, but about the organization and function of that stuff.
Right. It's about how the system works as a whole, not just its individual parts.
Okay, so we've got dualism with the separate mind and materialism with the mind being all about the physical world. But you mentioned another possibility, dual aspect monism. What's that all about?
Dual aspect monism tries to bridge that gap in a whole new way. It says that there's actually only one fundamental reality, but it has two aspects, the mental and the physical. So it's not two separate things, but like two sides of the same. Well, something.
So it's not that the mind is just a product of the physical world or that they're totally separate, but more like they're both expressions of something deeper.
Exactly. Think of a coin, right? One coin, two sides. You can look at either side, you can study them separately, but you can't have one without the other. They're both part of the same coin.
Okay, that coin analogy, that helps. But
Yeah.
what do we even mean by aspect?
Well, there are a few ways to think about it. Some folks see them as like fundamental properties of this underlying reality, kind of like an electron having both a charge and a spin. Others see it more like different perspectives, the subjective view versus the objective view. It could also be about different kinds of relationships, like the physical aspect describing cause and effect, and the mental aspect describing how things feel. And then some philosophers see mind and matter as fundamental categories of being, like they're both basic, but not separate substances.
So it's like we're not reducing one to the other, but we're also not saying they're totally independent.
Exactly. And that's how dual aspect monism gets around that pesky interaction problem that dualism has. If they're not really separate, then there's no need to explain how they influence each other because they're always connected at some deeper level.
Yeah, that makes sense. But how does all this explain consciousness, like that feeling of me being aware of the world?
Well, that's where the combination problem comes in. How do all these mental aspects, if they're even separate to begin with, combine to create that unified feeling of consciousness? And dual aspect monism takes a different approach than, say, panpsychism, which says that everything has a little bit of consciousness in it. Instead, it suggests that this underlying reality can express mental unity at higher levels of complexity, like in a brain. So it's not about adding up tiny bits of consciousness. It's about how this one thing manifests as a unified mind in complex systems.
So it's not like every atom has its own little mind, but more like consciousness emerges when things get complex enough.
Right. And the really interesting thing is there's some actual scientific theories that might fit with this idea, like integrated information theory, or IIT, and the free energy principle, or FEP.
Okay, those sound pretty complex, but let's see if we can break them down a bit.
Well, IIT basically says that consciousness is all about how integrated a system is, how much its parts work together as a whole. And they have this measure for that called phi, which in a dual aspect view might not just measure the physical complexity, but also the intensity of consciousness. So more integrated system, more intense experience.
So phi is like a single number that tells you both how complex the system is and how conscious it is. That's pretty neat.
And it leads to some interesting predictions, like changes in phi should correspond to changes in consciousness, and maybe even any system with a high enough phi could be conscious, even if it's not a brain.
So maybe my phone is a little bit conscious. I mean, it's pretty integrated these days. But what about the free energy principle?
So the FEP is about how the brain tries to minimize prediction error. Like it's always trying to guess what's going to happen next and adjust when it gets things wrong. And a dual aspect view might say that the mental side of this is what we experience as, well, experiencing things, like the feeling of seeing or hearing or thinking is all tied to this process of minimizing prediction error.
So my brain is constantly trying to predict the world, and that's what I'm experiencing as consciousness. Kind of makes you wonder who's really in control here.
Right. And there are some ways to test this. Like if you mess with the brain's predictions, maybe you could see changes in how people experience things. But there's another approach, too, called neurophenomenology, which is all about trying to map subjective experience to actual brain activity. Like if you can find those connections, it would be some pretty strong evidence for a dual aspect view.
Sounds like there's a lot of research still to be done here. But even if we accept dual aspect monism, there are still some big questions, right? Like, what is this underlying reality? Is it a substance or information or something else entirely?
Yeah, that's one of the criticisms of this whole framework. It can get a bit vague, and it's hard to pin down exactly what we're talking about. And some people, especially those who lean towards idealism, say that we don't even need a physical aspect at all. Maybe everything is just consciousness.
So many possibilities, so much to think about. But let's zoom in a bit and think about how all of this might relate to our sense of self, our identity. I mean, if consciousness is fundamental, does that change how we think about who we are?
It might. There are these classic theories of personal identity, like the body theory, the memory theory, the self as social construct, and the self as relational.
Hmm.
And maybe a consciousness-first view would change how we see them.
Okay, let's take those one by one. What about the body theory, the idea that who I am is tied to my body?
Well, maybe from a consciousness view, the body is more like an expression of this deeper consciousness. Like it's a vehicle for consciousness to interact with the world, but it's not the definition of who you are. It even opens up some pretty wild possibilities, like maybe the same consciousness could exist in different bodies.
Whoa, that's getting into some sci-fi territory. What about the memory theory, the idea that my identity is all about my memories, the continuity of my experiences?
Well, maybe memories aren't just stored in the brain, but also in this fundamental consciousness. Like the brain is just a tool for accessing them. So the continuity of memory is really the continuity of the self in this larger field of consciousness.
So my memories aren't just physical traces, they're part of my deeper self. And what about the social side of things? The idea that who we are is shaped by society, by our relationships and roles.
Yeah, that's the self as social construct view. And maybe in this framework, social stuff is like a structure that emerges within a collective consciousness. So even though our individual identities are shaped by society, it's all happening within this shared field of conscious experience. Like the individual and the social are both aspects of this larger thing.
Wow. So it's not just me, it's like us all
Yeah.
connected. And finally, what about the self as relational? The idea that who we are is defined by our relationships with others.
Well, maybe those relationships are more than just physical or social interactions. Maybe there are deeper connections within this fundamental consciousness. Like your sense of self is co-created by those conscious connections. And maybe all individual selves are like nodes in a single web of consciousness, all interconnected.
So no matter how you look at it, it seems like this consciousness first view changes how we think about personal identity. It's not just about the physical body or memories or social roles. It's about something deeper that all these things express or connect to.
Exactly. It's a whole different way of looking at who we are.
So where do we go from here? What's next for all these theories and ideas about dual aspect monism and consciousness?
Well, the folks working on this have laid out a kind of plan with some immediate goals and some bigger long-term goals. For now, they're really focusing on getting clear on what they mean by all these terms like aspect and proto-experience, and trying to find common ground between different theories and figuring out how to actually test these ideas scientifically.
So like laying the groundwork for a solid foundation. And what about the bigger picture?
Well, the long-term goal is pretty ambitious. They want to solve the combination problem for good, to understand how we go from those fundamental aspects to the unified consciousness we experience. And that's going to take some serious multi-scale modeling, like connecting the micro level to the macro level. Plus, there are all these ethical questions that come up, especially if we start thinking about consciousness and AI and other non-biological systems. Ultimately, the goal is a complete theory that explains everything from particles to people, all within this framework.
A theory of everything. That's a pretty tall order. But it sounds like an amazing journey, and it's going to take a lot of collaboration between different fields, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to take philosophers, neuroscientists, physicists, AI researchers, maybe even a few poets thrown in for good measure.
Well, this has been a wild ride. We've gone from ancient philosophy to cutting-edge science, all trying to understand this connection between our minds and the world. And this dual aspect monism, it's really a fascinating perspective, trying to find that underlying unity behind everything.
And even though we don't have all the answers, just thinking about these questions can change how we see ourselves and the universe.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you. If the mental and the physical really are just two sides of the same coin, what does that tell us about the nature of reality itself? And what does it mean for us as conscious beings existing in this vast, interconnected cosmos? Keep pondering that one, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.